In the airplane world, if you're ever in a jam, you're going to be tried and tested, and you're going to go through, hopefully, with flying colors. We're going to be talking to Sarah Rovner, who's done just that in the hangar.
Welcome to In the Hangar. We are on location at Stearman Field, so you may hear airplanes in the background or even the band, because there's a party going on at the ACCAs. I'm Christy Wong.
And I'm Dan Milliken, and our show is sponsored by Wingfield Aviation
And Flying Ice Optics. We love both of our sponsors.
Okay, well, so today we're going to be talking about emergencies and how to handle it from a pilot's point of view. And joining us is Sarah Rovner. Sarah, thanks so much for coming on the show. We've wanted to have you on for a long time, since the very beginning.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm glad it finally worked out.
Yeah, so we caught up with you here at the ACCAs, and you've started to create your own YouTube channel, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. I've been documenting a lot of my international ferry flights, including flying single-engine piston airplanes over large oceans, and I'm hoping to put a bunch of content out about the planning and the process, as well as some of the emergencies I faced over water.
And that is one of my bucket list items, is to fly my 210 across and over to Europe. I want to do that at some point. I don't know when, but I want to.
Are we taking Lola?
That's why I want to take Lola.
Okay.
So I know 210s have done the trip. I've seen them.
I've done one in a 210.
Sarah's, that's right. You did it in the
There you
same
go.
one that I had seen.
Yeah,
She did it in the one that 210
Echo uniform.
Echo uniform for the European guys who did that
Oh, very
around the
nice.
world thing. Okay, so Sarah, you arrived at the ACCAs today, and it was a really easy planned flight that you just landed and everything,
You're
right?
totally stress-free, right?
Yeah, that's what I was planning on, but sometimes it doesn't always work out that way.
So tell us what you were flying in at, what was your plan, and what happened?
So the original plan was for me to fly my newly acquired Cessna 170, endearingly named Stanley, up here from Gadsden, Alabama. And unfortunately, on my last international ferry flight, I got stuck up in the Arctic Circle for an extra 4 or 5 days. And
Love it.
unfortunately didn't have time to get here. And of course, in a Cessna 170, even 600 miles will take all day. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to take Stanley, so I figured that one of my really good friends, Dennis, we were going to take his Baron up here. And I was Dennis's multi-engine instructor in the Baron. And I helped him obtain his training in the Baron. And so I took the Baron up here, and we were coming in, did a low pass. Everything was just functioning normal. And when we turned onto the downwind, I noticed that the right engine wasn't making power as much as it should have been. And then it started to get worse. It started to kind of surge a little bit. You could kind of feel it into the rudders. And at that point, I knew something was wrong. So we cleaned it up, got up the gear up, got the flaps up, and started troubleshooting it. At that point, I realized that the oil temperature was absolutely pegged, and the oil pressure was down way below the acceptable range, something around 15 psi.
And time frame. I mean, you just did your low pass. You're just turning. Are we talking 5 minutes? What kind of time passed here?
I'd probably say less than 5 minutes. So from the time we did the low pass and everything was fine to turning downwind, from the point that we discovered that there might be a possible issue to the time we were on the ground was less than 5 minutes.
No, I'm talking about just the time frame of discovering the problem. I mean, it was pretty quick, right? I mean, you turned upwind and then or crosswind and then downwind, and you noticed it during the downwind.
Yes, we put the gear down and the flaps down in the downwind, and at that point I knew that we were losing the right engine. And we decided to extend the downwind and continue to try to troubleshoot to see what was wrong.
Okay. You find out that there's something wrong. You realize that the oil pressure is not where you want it to be. What do you do next?
Well, there's an emergency procedure for everything, of course. You have emergency memory items, and then you have checklist items, followed by normal checklist items. So the first thing that I did is I wanted to get the drag away. So I knew that there was going to be a problem, and there was a bunch of people landing here. I think that there was somebody else who was already on short final, and there was a bunch of people who were landing on the Stoll runway. And I said, okay, there's a lot of traffic here. This is not the place to be troubleshooting an emergency. So I flew a little bit out to the northeast, and then I said, well, maybe there's a mixture issue or something, because we just come from cruise. And so I was kind of going through all the normal stuff. I mean, hey, both mags are on, the prop levers are where they're supposed to be, but just something wasn't right. And then when I noticed that the oil pressure was low and the oil temperature was high, I knew that we had a problem.
So you went to the big airport then in Wichita.
It was a decision that we were trying to make, as a team. And, one of the concerns was that, first of all, this is a very narrow runway. There's a lot of traffic here. There's a lot of people right next to the runway. and with a failing engine, with half flaps, and considering that the winds were gusting to almost 30 knots today,
Yeah.
it just really wasn't the best option for a runway. So we decided to go over to Wichita. When we were on short final, I'd probably say we were about on a 3-mile final for runway 19 right. That's when the oil blew and the oil started coming all the way down the right engine. At that point, the engine failed and we feathered the engine, did our emergency
On
memory
short
items.
final?
Yes, on short final, feathered the engine, and then landed safely.
Wow. Okay.
Did you declare emergency?
Yes, we declared an emergency.
When?
As soon as the engine quit.
Okay,
At
so on
first-
short finals when you called.
At first, it was a precautionary landing because we still had full engine
And
power.
Tower knew that. You informed them in any
Yes.
trouble, or
Yeah,
I mean,
we
what do you?
informed them.
Yeah, as a pilot, I don't know when. I've never had an emergency like that. When did you make the call that? What did you say to Tower when you diverted to ICT?
Well, when we train as airline pilots, we're told never to spare the emergency word. We're always taught that in any type of situation where the outcome of the landing is unknown or you have a failed system, to always declare the emergency. While I didn't say declaring an emergency at this time, I informed them of the engine trouble. And then when the engine quit completely, I declared that as well to the tower. So it was very clear that we were coming in for mechanical failures. And when the engine quit at that point, then the emergency was declared. Because at that point, the engine was running. It was developing, 2,500 RPM until it wasn't.
And who was flying, and who was right seat?
I was right seat as a multi-engine instructor since Dennis was regaining his currency. So I was PIC for the flight as the instructor.
And were you pilot flying on short final?
Yes, I took control of the aircraft as soon as we finished the emergency memory items, and then I landed the aircraft.
Okay.
Wow. I bet you gave them some excitement for the day.
Yes, I did. They were actually shocked. I actually showed the responding firefighters and the police officers where the connecting rod actually went through the case.
Oh,
There was
my
oil
goodness.
everywhere. We almost slipped and fell just trying to get down the wing because there was so much oil everywhere.
Wow. So it was very, very good decision making that you got. It was a really good idea to go to Wichita, the big airport,
Oh,
because
definitely.
who knows what would have happened here. I mean, at that point, there's really no room for a go around. You know what I mean?
No, and with all the people around, I just didn't want my emergency to become everybody else's emergency.
Yeah, that's a really good way to think about it.
Well, and Sarah, I know just from wanting to get you on the show before and doing a little bit of research, this isn't the first emergency you've had. I want to go way back because the one I think about the most is I know you had an engine out, single engine airplane at night, which to me is my biggest fear. So let's go back to Houston and what happened there.
So it was the night of January 3rd, 2012. November 54872 was the tail number. It was a Civil Air Patrol aircraft. At the time, I had belonged to a Civil Air Patrol squadron in the West Houston area, and I had been flying back and forth from Conroe in the Conroe's 172 over to West Houston for my meetings. So it was a routine flight. I would go down there. The meeting would start at 7, and then it would end at 9. And then I would fly back because, Houston traffic, as you probably know, Fort
Oh, yeah.
Worth and Dallas traffic is absolutely awful. So it was kind of the most efficient way to build time. I had 108.3 hours at the time. And people
Wow.
say, why 8, why are you adding the 8.3? I was like, that's like $1,000 difference when you're renting. So
Oh, wow.
108.3 hours. And I'd only had my private pilot certificate for only 3 months.
Oh, wow.
And when I was about 10 miles from the Conroe, airport, the engine seized with no warning, just got completely quiet. Propeller was windmilling. I had no idea, but at the time, what had happened was the rear crankshaft gear dowel pin had failed, shearing off
That'll do
and pretty much disconnecting all the accessories from the engine. So
And it's important, I think, to note that, I mean, you know this now, but you didn't know this at the time and nobody knew it for a while. Because I think we'll get back to that in a minute. So then what happened?
So I declared an emergency and started going through my emergency procedures, all my emergency memory items, carb, heat, everything like that. And ironically, you're talking about that. It was almost perfect conditions that night for carb icing. And that's what people thought the original cause was until the NTSB had gone through the engine. And so I set up for landing. As I was coming down, I knew that the area was heavily wooded and also residential. And when I got down to about 800 feet or so, I saw a street light and decided to go for the road.
Wow.
People say, well, what was it? I was like, oh, it was 2 greens and a red. So I remember that pretty vividly
2 greens and a red.
for the street light.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. So 2 greens and a red, and I decided to line up and land on the road. As I was coming down, the wingtips were actually starting to scrape the power lines that were running parallel to the road. So people say, well, how wide was the road? I said, well, it must have been, 34 feet because the plane was 35. So I actually hit the power lines, the wingtips got chewed up in them. And then right ahead, I saw power lines that were running perpendicular to the road. And I hit those pretty much head on. And they actually broke off the pole and were spinning around in the propeller.
Wow.
I landed safely and I couldn't believe it. I was on the ground, I was safe. And then the right wing caught a telephone pole and spun the plane around.
Wow.
And that was my first introduction to emergency procedures.
Welcome to aviation.
Yes.
So what I'm hearing is that if I want to experience an in-flight emergency, I should probably go fly with you, and then you can show me the ropes so that way I'm prepared. Okay.
I hadn't had an engine failure in a while, so I was kind of surprised. I guess it was my time again, today.
Yeah, no kidding. What other kind of emergencies have you experienced? Because you ferry airplanes all over the place. Surely you've experienced a lot more than that.
I have, unfortunately. I think that I was counting it up today. I think I've had 4 forced landings. I don't really count today as a forced landing.
Right.
Because, it's a one-engine approach and landing. It's what you do on your check ride. It's what you train for. It's what I do a lot now as a multi-engine instructor. So it was really not that big of a deal. But as far as other emergencies, I've had 4 forced landings, 2 on airport, 2 off airport, and now 8 engine failures total.
Excellent.
So I've had quite a few.
Engine failures. And wow. And then you're ferrying across the North Atlantic in single piston airplanes.
I had some emergencies in the Turbo Saratoga from a few weeks ago. So.
Oh my goodness.
What was you got to tell us that.
I was on approach to Greenland and I had an avionics overheat message. And I would have, so it turns out that it was an erroneous message after I got it looked at. But I had an avionics overheat message. And then after landing in the Netherlands, I actually had the wiring for the master switch fail. So it was just one thing after another with that airplane.
Oh man. I bet the new owners are pleased.
Oh, they are. I mean, the airplane got there safely.
Okay, well, that's good.
Yeah. Wow. So what would you say to maybe that person who's got 3 months ago got their PPL? What would you say is the most important thing to have in your mind in an emergency?
Definitely practice. Kind of what Dan was speaking about today at the ACAAs. We're talking about this grassroots AQP program that's supposed to introduce pilots to all these emergencies. And, for the most part, most emergencies are very manageable. I had a great instructor when I was in initial new hire training at the regionals, and he had a saying. He said there's 2 types of emergencies, 1 sip emergencies and 2 sip emergencies. And he said, well, one you take 1 sip of coffee and deal with it, and the other one you take 2 sips of coffee and deal with it. Now, while most emergencies are fairly benign, like a generator goes out or a radio failure or something like that, there are emergencies that are more on the extreme side. And if you do have an extreme emergency, you have to have a much more quick response. So my best advice for anybody out there is to know your aircraft, train regularly, and be aware of any type of emergency memory items or emergency procedures for that particular aircraft. Just knowing the best glide speed as well as your initial actions to take in an engine failure can save your life.
That's really good advice.
That is good advice. Okay, so what's next for you, Sarah?
Well, as I'm sure that many people know, the airlines, my normal airline job is not going to be as stable as I thought it would be. So right now the plan is to continue ferrying on a full-time basis and continue instructing. I've got 2 tailwheel airplanes that I've been doing weekend tailwheel courses in, Stanley and Patches, so Cessna 170 and a Super Cub. And I plan to continue doing that throughout my tenure as a possibly furloughed airline pilot.
I feel you.
No.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking emergencies with us. It's fascinating. I'm sure we could stay here and talk all night. But with that, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. They've got a party outside that I want to get to. So,
And thanks, Sarah, for coming and being on this show with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
And you guys stay safe. Know your glide speed. Know your emergency things that you need to know right away, your memory items. And we'll see you guys next time in the hangar.